My name is Aaron Absley. I'm a full-time botanical artist, and I've been painting and doing watercolor for a very long time. And today I wanted to go through and show you everything that I use in my studio on a day-to-day basis. Especially if you're starting out as a new artist, it can be really overwhelming shopping for art supplies. In this video, I'm hopefully going to make some of those decisions easier for you. Art supplies can be really expensive, but you don't have to spend a bunch of money buying everything all at once. None of this video is sponsored, just want to share exactly what I prefer and what I've found over the years is what I like to use. So we'll get started with what I think is the most important out of all watercolor supplies, and that's paper. So paper really is the most important part of any watercolor painting. With other media such as acrylic, you're painting more on the surface of the paper, but watercolor absorbs into the paper. So it really matters what sort of paper you use. So I stick to 100% cotton paper because it really has the best internal qualities for that absorbing the pigment. And what I've mostly used in recent years is Blick brand, just because it's a little more affordable. It's also just as good quality. For botanical work, I use almost exclusively hot press. So hot press is just a very smooth surface as opposed to cold press, which has more texture. So mostly when I buy the paper, it comes on a block like this. And a block is, in this case, 20 sheets of 140-pound paper, which isn't super thick, and they're glued on the edge. So by buying a block, you get a lot of paper in a nice package that you can paint directly on the surface of, and the glue holds the paper together. So if you're not buying on a block, you can also buy individual sheets of paper. So something like this large 24 by 30 inch sheet. And this is cold pressed, so it has much more of that texture that a lot of people prefer for especially non-botanical work. And you can either do a large painting or cut this down into whatever size you prefer. And that's also more economical than buying smaller sheets. And then you can also, with the individual sheets, get thicker 300-pound paper that won't warp as much. So whether you're painting on the block or after you've finished your painting, you want to remove each sheet from the block. And this one's already separated a little bit here, but they come with a little section that's not glued. And the tool that I found most useful for that, I've tried, a credit card, a palette knife, things like that, and you risk ripping the paper if you use the wrong tools. So what I always use is what's called a bone folder, and this is a very simple tool that is used for folding paper like origami and things like that, and it just has a very blunt edge, and you can use it to very easily separate the top layer of paper from the block. So let's say your paper comes off your block before you finish painting, or you're using a cut down sheet from a larger individual sheet. You're going to need a solid surface to paint on. So what I use for that is a board, and you can buy drawing boards, but it's pretty expensive for what it is. So I've made my own, and I have several like this. It's just a nice piece of plywood from Home Depot. This is 1/2-inch plywood. And I just sanded it really nicely and put an acrylic finish on it. It's just a really nice, useful tool to have around the studio, and I have boards in several sizes. It also allows you to work on multiple paintings at once if you have multiple boards. So what the board allows you to do is to tape your paper to the board. And I wouldn't want to tape the paper to the desk, because what I like to do is move the painting around and rotate it and then move it off the desk if I need to in the middle of the process. So for tape, what you want to use is what's called artist tape. It's similar to masking tape, but you definitely don't want to use actual masking tape. Artist tape is not quite as sticky, and it's also acid free, so if you leave it on your paper too long, it's not going to stain or yellow or anything like that. So every piece of botanical art that I do is going to start with some sort of drawing. I don't like to do a lot of sketches in like a sketchbook or small thumbnails, but I typically do like to do larger drawings to plan out my composition. So for that, I will use a sketch pad like this and larger sheets of drawing paper so that I can draw more at the same size that the actual painting is going to be. And I'll just do very loose compositions, something like this, help me map out how things are going to fit on the page. I'm not too picky about pencils, but I do have a few preferences. I've seen a lot of people recommend that you use a really hard pencil, for example, a 2H or 4H. But the problem that I've found with the harder leads, although they do make a very light line, is that the hard graphite can actually dig into your watercolor paper. And even though if you erase the graphite, you'll have that groove in your paper. On the other end, you have your 4B or your 6B, it will tend to draw very dark and the graphite will smudge around a lot, so we don't want to do that either. What I typically will use is just the middle ground, your HB pencil. It isn't too dark, it isn't too light, and it erases nicely. I found that these Staedtler Mars Lumograph drawing pencils are very high quality, and I'll tend to buy those and just the HB as my go-to drawing pencil. I also just use a mechanical pencil a lot of times for something that I know is going to draw a nice sharp line, and with a nice 2B or HB lead. So I definitely make a ton of mistakes and change my mind and change my compositions a lot when I'm drawing, and for that you're going to need a good eraser. So I will use what's called a kneaded eraser, or I call it a gum eraser because it's like chewing gum. And the nice thing about the kneaded eraser is that it doesn't leave any shavings or residue behind. So then the other tool that I use a lot at this stage when I'm drawing is a ruler, and I really like this clear gridded ruler. And what's nice about this is for centering your composition, I usually will give myself some hash marks, and that just kind of keeps me spot on where my composition wants to be, or you're just measuring your reference. Very good tool to have on hand. So the most common question I get about supplies is, what kind of paint do you use? So I always buy paint in these tubes. And if you've never bought watercolor in a tube before, it's exactly the same type of paint as you'd get in a palette like this. The tube paint dries solid, and you can re-wet it and reuse it over and over. So you're going to want to put your tube paint into some sort of a palette. You can get something small like this, or what I use is a large palette with, I think this has 32 wells in it and a large area for mixing. Mostly what I use are Winsor & Newton brand. I've used some other brands as well, and they'll have some slight differences, but mostly if you're buying the professional quality watercolor, you're going to get a quality paint. Some of the other brands I've used include Sennelier, Daniel Smith, M. Graham, and then Winsor & Newton I usually default to just because they have a lot of selection and I've generally had good results with all of their colors. I'm going to do another video soon that goes more in depth on the pigments that I like, but really when it comes to buying watercolor, what matters the most is the different pigments, and there's a lot I can discuss there that we'll go into in another video. So some of the tubes I have here in my box of paints are actually gouache. Gouache is basically just opaque watercolor. I find it very useful for some techniques and when you want more of an illustration style look, and it can be layered or mixed right in with watercolor. What I use is designer's gouache by Winsor & Newton is pretty much the standard for most people. This is the old style of tube, and then this is the new one. Comes in a full range of colors, but mostly you're going to want to just buy a tube of white. And then if you want to tint it, you can mix it straight in with watercolor. You're going to want a separate palette probably for your gouache so it doesn't get too mixed in with your normal watercolors. And for that, I just use a little saucer. The only other type of paint that I use regularly is this little jar. It's called Bleed Proof White. It's made by Dr. P.H. Martins. So this is basically like a super gouache. It's extremely bright white, opaque. It's almost like whiteout. So while gouache can be a little dull and not completely opaque at times, this stuff is super bright and can be used when you really need that bright white highlight. So the next thing I want to talk about are brushes. I think more than the paint and the paper, brushes are really a matter of personal preference. When you go to buy artist brushes, you'll see that there are what's called synthetic brushes and then natural hair brushes. One of the biggest differences is that the natural brushes are a lot more expensive. I use both. Here are some of my synthetic brushes that I regularly use. I really like how stiff the bristles are and just that there are a lot of relatively affordable options. As you can see, I mostly buy smaller brushes, which is nice obviously for detail. After years of painting with mostly synthetic brushes, I recently started investing a bit more money in these natural sable hair brushes. I really love working with these. They hold a great point. They hold more water, but you really have to remember that brushes are just a tool. They aren't going to make or break your painting the way that the paper you're using might. And you're not going to see the brush in the final result of your painting like you will the color that you're using. You should really just use whatever brushes you're most comfortable with, or if you're just starting out, use whatever you have on hand. And then you can invest in more of the types of brushes that work well for you. So another thing that you will use a lot in watercolor is masking fluid. That's just a liquid latex material that is used to preserve the white of the paper. So there's a lot of different brands and slight variations in masking fluid. I don't go through it fast enough to really have a strong preference or have tried that many different types. I think they're all pretty similar. What I will recommend is to apply it. You definitely don't want to use a regular paintbrush because it will dry to basically rubber and completely gum up your brush and destroy it. So you can buy what's called a color shaper tool. It's got a silicone nib on it, and that is the perfect tool that I found to apply the masking fluid. And then to remove the masking fluid cleanly, you're going to want to use a rubber cement eraser. The only other things you're really going to need for doing the actual painting are something to hold water and paper towels. So I use just a big roll of paper towels, keep it on hand in the studio. You use the paper towel to regulate the amount of water that's in your brush. The other nice thing about paper towels is you don't get a lot of dust or lint that comes off of a towel compared to, for example, a cotton rag. And I probably just go through a couple of rolls a year in my studio, even though I'm painting all the time. So it's not a big expense or a huge waste in my opinion. And then for water, a larger capacity container is nice because then you don't have to change your water as much. I found these stackable storage containers that work really well. I like that it has a wide mouth, and one other important thing is it doesn't look like a mug of coffee or a cup of water, so I don't make that mistake very often with these. When it comes to actually painting, I've shown my palette, the tubes that I use, my brushes, and then the paper. And other than, a few extra small items here and there, that's really all you need to do watercolor painting. It's not a huge upfront investment. That's one of the things I really like about it. And if it's not something I talked about here and you're at the art supply store, then it's probably not something that you really need to do watercolor painting. The last part of this video, I'm going to talk about the rest of my studio setup, the lights and the things like that, just in case you're curious about how you might set up your own studio environment. Probably the most important part of my studio is my desk. This is the Trotten, I believe, standing desk from IKEA. So it's adjustable in height. It goes up from like here, where I'm standing right now, down to a regular sitting position. And I usually keep it somewhere in the middle where I have like an office counter height drafting chair. It doesn't tilt back like a traditional drafting table, but for watercolor, you probably want a flat desk. It's a pretty large size desk, and it was relatively affordable since it was from IKEA, so I thought it was a great choice for a large studio table. Possibly more important than your desk is the lights. You want to be able to see your work and have accurate color, and that's something I've been constantly trying to improve in my studio setup. The first thing you can do is set up somewhere where you have natural light. I have an east-facing window here and a south-facing window over there that a lot of times during the day we'll have the blinds down because I don't want direct light and light movement coming onto my work, but it helps to have the ambient light. But natural light will give you the best, most natural color. So if you can have indirect natural light, that's great. Of course, you want brighter light directly on your work. So what I've always had is a big arm light like this. This lamp is fairly old and it uses a fluorescent bulb, which I don't think you can even buy a replacement for this anymore. But of course they make LED bulbs for most lights these days. You don't want to just buy the cheapest bulbs that you can find for your artwork. The higher end bulbs and the ones with a higher CRI rating will give you much better color accuracy. So for years I had this lamp, and then I would use another lamp on the other side of my desk, have one over my palette and one over my painting. What I fairly recently invested in is full studio lights on my ceiling. So that lights up the whole room, and that's actually made a world of difference in my studio setup. The main thing I like about it is everything's lit very evenly, and especially if I'm painting from life and I have a plant or my subject sitting in front of me, a lot of times in the past when I had this lamp over my painting, the subject would be in the dark or lit even like from below. So having my whole studio set up lit from above with these nice lights has been fantastic. And then the last thing I want to talk about for the process of doing botanical art that's very important is having good reference. I paint from life, but a lot of times I paint from photographs. So for that, I've always been into taking a lot of photos whenever I go places and take photos of plants. This is my old camera. I recently got a nice mirrorless camera, which is what we're filming this on. Even if you just use your phone, think of that as part of your art setup. Just make sure to take lots of photos and think about your reference. And then when it comes to using photo reference, I know a lot of people might prefer to look off of a computer screen or an iPad or whatever. I find it a lot easier to translate from paper onto paper, basically, not from a screen. So I'll typically print things out. And for that, I recommend getting an eco tank printer, which makes the cost of ink really negligible. And I'll just do printouts like this. The color isn't perfect, but the detail is pretty good. And that allows you, especially when you're doing the drawing part of the painting, to have something right in front of you that you can reference. So that was pretty much the full list of every material that I could think of that I use in my studio on a daily basis, from the reference materials to creating the finished painting. I hope it was helpful if you're looking to set up your own studio or just getting started, or if you are more experienced with watercolor and you have different preferences or you have questions, please let me know in the comments. I definitely will do some more videos in the future, especially on the brushes and the paper and the paint. So be sure to follow along and look for those in the future. Thanks for watching. Bye.